Hey, welcome to Bookwarm Games, Alexander Schmid. How are you doing?
I'm doing very well, Mr. West Chance. How are you?
I'm all right. I'm all right. It's been a long time, maybe too long, before I've had you on the show. This is the 17th episode of Bookworm Games. I know I've been on your show, well, at least that many times by now. Are you are you looking forward to this? Are you feeling uh ready to play some Earthbound?
Yeah, I mean, I've thought about this a lot, and I'm very honored to be on your show, and I'm very happy to be in this metaphorical seat. And it's funny because in preparing for the show, and it's funny that I prepare for shows now because I used to not like to prepare for shows or lectures and just try and kind of rely on sprezzatura. But now it's like I've expanded my game, and that now part of the game is the preparation, sort of like dressing up is part of going out, putting on your
Yeah, yeah,
costume to enact to get a richer sense of the ritual. Um,
totally.
and I
Well,
was
hey, I'm very glad you could be on and thanks again for really getting me started in podcasting. I I think I wanted to start by talking about some of the things that you do besides podcasting. I know you're a teacher and a student. I know you read a lot of books these days on your summer break, and I know that you're also a big frisbee player these days. Is there am I leaving things out? What else are you up to these days?
well, I exercise some too, and I've recently been like a spin class person or just using exercise bikes. So what's sort of
Like a
funny about
teacher?
like sort of like generally the bikes that don't have much of a display don't have TVs on them, but
Uh-huh.
do you can affect their resistance. The ones that you might see in mass in a resistance room in like a big gym, like a 24-hour fitness or an LA Fitness. Um,
Okay.
so I usually log something like 15 to 20 miles on those, just trying to keep my aerobic capacity up and keep
And
my weight. Yeah,
do you have somebody like training you during that, or is it sort of like it's just open, you show up and you ride the bike?
it depends. Most of the time, I do it by myself, though it is a lot more fun when there is a trainer present and there's a class
Yeah.
going on.
Y- Yeah, then I'm thinking like, okay, so it's like the kind of this thing you're talking about where you're preparing for versus just playing. It's sort of like that too with training, right? You're training for something when you're playing alone, you're sort of competing against yourself in a way versus once you're in the class or you're in the I don't know, the discussion or whatever, then you're playing and competing with other people to an extent. And that little that's where I kind of wanted to start was that distinction between and the connection between those two sort of realms of play and competition. And I just kind of want to get some general thoughts from you on those two, how they relate, how they're different.
Well, I think competition is an essential element in sophisticated play and even unsophisticated play. Like our friend Dr. Jordan B. Peterson says of the research of Jock Painstep, he's found out that even rats have a play circuit, and that
Yeah.
the most basic way that rats play with each other is a larger male rat with a smaller male rat. They'll wrestle, and the larger one will establish dominance. But then after the smaller one comes back and cues it to play again, using probably lordosis, like what the females use in order to indicate desire to mate, they
Uh-huh.
the if the bigger one does not allow the smaller one to win at least 33% of the time, they will abolish the relationship. They will stop playing.
Huh.
And so it seems as if competition is a necessary part of play, that there has to be a winner and there has to be a loser if you look at just the single instance of play. But if you
Ah.
look at play spread out across time, both of you are winners and losers, but even greater winners because because you get to play with each other and develop a
Yeah.
relationship, like we were talking about yesterday. um, um, that that's more like the equilibrated state. That seems to be like why you want to be a good sport. But
Yeah.
um, and I would say that something about competition. And I was reading Homo Ludens, just the first
Oh,
few
nice.
pages on your recommendation, and right before we came on, and it seems like what how Huizinga, I think I said his name right,
Who
defines
knows? Yeah.
yeah defines play as having fun, and what
Yeah.
fun it, and that having fun is activity infused with meaning,
Yeah.
in of
I
itself.
I just
And
love his definitions. Yeah, he's so, I mean, provocative, insightful, but also like rooted in a lot of philological work and a lot of
Mhm.
study of medieval society. Actually, at some point he explains that his work about the waning of the Middle Ages, his big work on the late Middle Age cultures or the high
Yeah,
Middle Age cultures, going into the late, is kind of where he got this fascination with play and fun and games and their connection to culture as a whole. Yeah,
and
yeah. So his words, the Paideia and Agon, he talks about those two. So the Greeks kind of distinguish with
mhm.
in language between these two kinds of play. Paideia related to the word for child, of course, and for education, and then Agon, which is the agonistic, the thing that you see in the tragedies and the plays where the characters will have a verbal contest, or that you'll see, of course, in Homer, the great set battles between heroic Trojans and archaic Greeks and whatnot. So these distinctions seem to, over time, sort of blend together. We in English, of course, use play to cover that whole kind of broad stretch of meanings. We use it to talk about music as well. So it seems like over time, his insight seems to be correct, that play kind of infuses itself into all aspects of the culture, um, including its use in language, and the way that the winner and the loser have to sort of respect one another. That seems to be borne out as well, right? Like, because play fighting is certainly one of the ways that we play, but there's so many more, and we sort of I think we learned so much from losing that we got the sense that it wasn't the be all end all to win, but that a sort of a game that you can keep playing is really the goal. Like you say, like uh, is it Ponskep? Is that one of his insights, or is that Peterson's kind of interpretation of him?
Well, Pinksep has did the research on the rats, and Peterson
Ah,
presented in a general context, comparing it also with well socialized king chimpanzees,
ah,
suggesting that what makes like the most dominant human, the best human, is a human who plays the best, not
mm,
necessarily the most brutal one. Because what is
yes,
play but like in a maze, through trial and error, seeking the way forward towards one's goal and getting
yeah,
through whatever necessary obstacles, and thus accepting, like saying an RPG, like we both love, um,
yeah,
you have to level up. You just got to grind and get stronger. And
right,
which seems to be what you and I are sort of doing right now. We're trying to up our podcast game through podcasting more and spending more time on the air. And I think we're both pretty diligently studying. And I would say I'm adding, so rather than playing in the CrossFit sort of way that I used to, you asked early
uh-huh.
on when we started to podcast, what did I sacrifice to
Oh yeah,
podcast? And so something really interesting here is, here, I think I can nail a coffin on a major concept of Western civilization right here.
okay,
I realized that the phoenix imagery in relation to the alchemical imagery of disintegrating and then being resolved into something greater, something renewed, from
uh-huh.
going from being the old blind king to becoming the new renewed hero Marduk king with eyes all around your head who can speak magic
Mm,
words. What that is dissolving your former role in reality and then being
hmm,
born into a new one. So like you were student, now you're teacher. You were son, now you're father. And we all have to do that symbolically in our
mm.
existence, which is what I thought was so interesting about the point that you made about the point you made. Um, sorry, I'm losing my train as I always do. Um, but
About losing and winning, that kind of thing, like
right,
that
because
lose. Yeah,
when you lose now, you just put on the loser's cap for a moment. You don't die or
ah,
commit seppuku, or it's as if we realized that we could, in not having to die after each loss, um,
yeah,
and not having to sacrifice ourselves after each loss, we could sacrifice our ideas or our strategies instead. It seems like that seems to be sort of like the inversion of the Christian way of looking at things from the pagan. Instead of sacrificing ourselves for our ideas, we learn to sacrifice our ideas for ourselves, which is what makes it interesting that you go from, say, like physical war to like physical play, like football, to more even more abstract play, like video game football, where you can play out even more scenarios. And then, we're here now talking about play. And so, I mean, just to go all the way back to the original point, kind of, about Panksepp and rats and what play seems to be, is it seems to be creating artificial limits, like in Play Anything, what Ian Bogo says, and I'm not trying to act as if I've read that all yet, but based on your representation of them, creating artificial or an arbitrary, but only arbitrary in terms of like getting you to the goal, restrictions upon yourself in order to sharpen your ability to work towards goals that you set or are set for you, and that is what sharpens like the logos, which makes best or most socialized ruler, would have been Peterson's point.
I think so. Yeah, I think it's interesting to kind of get the images of mythology and be able to pretty, I think, convincingly or at least provocatively map onto them a lot of these kind of discoveries of psychology, of neuroscience. And I think that in so doing, it seems like you as the person sort of articulating those ideas and how they connect, I think are doing a really important thing in sort of revitalizing, to use the phoenix image again, like revitalizing the study of humanities, because it's sort of like you reconnect it to, on the one hand, its oldest manifestations in myth, and then on the other hand, connect it to the newest and the most necessary sort of discoveries of statistics and psychological research and things like that. So you sort of you infuse it and you ground it in a way that that makes it convincing, makes it meaningful, right? Like there's more to this like book that I'm reading than just like trying to figure out a display of authorial brilliance or contextualizing it within a historical framework or something like that, right? Like it just opens up the thing that you read in so many new ways. And I think that there's, well, just the last point here was like the way that this can happen with texts seems to be emerging out of people observing the way that it happens with games. And I just wonder what you think about the idea of a text as a game and that activity of interpretation as a game.
Well, first and foremost, just something you said was so interesting, of course.
Thank you.
Where oh no, how am I already losing my train of thought on that? When you said, okay, so Texas game, and then the first part was just the idea of re-embodying the myths and seeing that which they actually say. Well, something just, fascinating about that is when Peterson and Jung said that basically we all exist with a veil of ignorance like Maya around us, and we're always skating on thin ice, and we constantly fall through, and it's our own ignorance which keeps us from seeing that. Then that allowed me to see that the second you re-embody these myths or these stories using the logos, once you understand them and start infusing them with that which we know now, you reinvigorate them. You bring them back into existence, like you said, like bringing the old king back to existence, or the rising phoenix. And why can you do that? And why can that infinitely be done? It's like because we always know so little and have such a simplistic view of how things are, that there's so much more infinite complexity, especially to these myths which express something that is functionally eternal for us, that there's so much more that we don't know about them than what we do, that the appropriate way to meet them is like on your knees with awe, not with your head turned and snidely looking down it as if it's the product of, as if, what are you snidely looking down on but a product of your own imagination, right?
Absolutely.
Your own projection. And so I think that's the that is what is most appropriate about restudying that which has value and going back into the mines and looking for the gold, as it were, going to Laputa and looking for the crystal.
Yes.
Is that the just as our lives seem to have actual stages that we will go through, regardless of how individual we are, so has culture had such stages as well. And in learning that, you learn to accept what is true and inevitable and objective and must exist, the sort of tyranny of existence, both socially and naturally. But also within that, I think you learn, like when you learn the rules of a game, how to play and what sort of player you would like to be within the game and what sort of outcome you would actually like to pursue. And then that also takes a ton of pressure off you, because instead of being the game developer who's just sitting around thinking about how the game's not so good all the time, you can actually do the most fun thing in the world, which is what? Play it.
Right. Yeah. It to me, like, reading has always been fun. Playing these games has always been fun. And I as a teacher now, my main goal, I think, in what I'm doing here, what I'm trying to do with you and these podcasts and things, is like make a way of an avenue for sharing that delight in the things that I've learned from these books and these games, making that open to as many people as possible. And not only that, but also, as your podcast and your discussions of the Iliad did for me, to inspire other people to sort of jump on board and participate and share about the kinds of works and games and things that they're really interested in, and have that kind
Yes.
of larger conversation grow out of it. Um,
I was thinking about that. I was thinking about that today, that part of the fun of a game is getting more of your friends to play it. And then, so what was it we were working on off the air this morning? We were trying to integrate our friend Sarah Miller into another segment. And we're already moving forward on that. She's already agreed, which we're very excited on. And you've already started the process of having a shared document so we can start putting something together.
yeah.
And so that seems to be part of the goal of, say our goal were to have a new golden age, which would of course be supremely possible these days, given our economic situation, our health situation, and our electronic connectivity situation.
Right.
The whole idea would be that if we're showing what we have delight in, and I think this is exactly what you were saying, and we get our friends to do that, and then at some point, just iterative growth turns into exponential growth. And instead of just one person having a time, there's been an age, or an age has been born.
Yeah, well, and it's not that we're like giving birth to this thing, but we're sort of like, I mean, jumping onto this.
Latching onto it.
It's already going, and it's just a matter of sort of like, yeah, how far does that growth go? How do you channel that growth in the most productive way to the best things and the best ideas, which will sort of inspire people to look again at some things that they might have dismissed before, or think in a new way about some ideas which might otherwise seem either passé or dangerous or whatever. So I think this is where I wanted to go into Earthbound a little bit, was with the one of these things that is so interesting is the role of IQ. And this is a topic that I don't know a whole lot about, but from playing Earthbound, I know that it's a thing, because if you look in your status, you can check the IQ of each of your party members at any time. And as you go on your adventure, your IQ goes up each time you gain a level, or not necessarily each level that you gain, but it's one of the stats that can rise when you gain in levels. And the characters' IQs are a little bit different. And this is kind of interesting. So they do all have a high IQ, from what I can gather. Like the main character, Ness, his is going to be at a kind of baseline, I guess around 100 or so before the end of the game. Paula is the main psychic attack user in the game. Her IQ is going to be a bit higher than his generally, and you can then choose whether you want to skew hers even higher, because her IQ points will sort of determine how much damage her psychic attacks will deal. Or you can choose, when you find IQ pills, which you do from time to time, you can choose to give those over to the third character in the game, whose default name is Jeff. And his IQ does something different. He has no psychic power. He has no psychic points. Instead, what he does with IQ is he can fix broken objects that you find on your adventure. So the higher his IQ is, the better a chance you have of fixing those objects. And once it's at a certain threshold, you can fix ones that otherwise you wouldn't have had any chance of fixing. So that's kind of, well, there's also Prince Pooh from the East, but by the time he joins your party, you've probably already sort of between either Paula or Jeff, which one you're gonna try to increase the IQ of the most. Or I suppose you can always, of course, just hand out IQ points liberally if you'd like, and try to balance out your party in that way. So there's, does that make sense? There's like sort of two main things that I'm getting from that IQ correlate with, and it's sort of this myth science dichotomy again. It's either it increases your psychic, which is essentially like magic ability, or it increases your technological prowess.
Well, that's very interesting because I mean that would map onto Jordan Peterson's, and he didn't come up with the big five, but he did help with the research necessary to produce it. There's a dimension called openness, and within that dimension, there are two aspects, and one is intellect, and the other is, I think, openness to experience. And intellect is the biggest predictor of whether you're going to go into the sciences, whereas openness to experience is the biggest predictor of whether you will go into the humanities. And there's in the statistics a higher percentage of men who have higher intellects in that way, and intellect doesn't here correlate perfectly with IQ because it's interest in ideas rather than what would be represented, the G factor on an IQ test. And there are more women that have the higher sort of openness to experience. And you might even say that this suggests that openness to experience correlates highly with fluency in language, verbal fluency, whereas intellect is better ability to manipulate abstractions, like spatial objects in one's mind. And so that would map on to Jeff very well, because what can he do? Well, he can fix objects, which means that he can see in his mind how the object should be, and then take the map from his mind and map that into reality, right? He figures out what is necessary to add to this not working thing to make it now working. And so Paula, what can she do? Well, what is a psychic attack? It's an attack of ideas, right?
Exactly.
And what can you do with ideas? Well, you can upset somebody's emotional systems. And this is something I'm reading in Joseph Ledoux. There's a very close connection. He's a neuroscientist, between emotional reaction and emotional action. Both are regulated by the amygdala, though there are two different subsystems which govern. So there's a difference between what governs your reaction and your action. So like when Atlanta was bombed in the 1996 Olympics, people just froze. But then they ran after several seconds. Well, we did research with rats, and basically you can put them in a box with a white side and a black side, and you make a sound go off, and then they get shocked on the white side. So over time, they get faster and faster, just running over to the black side once they hear the sound. So we figured out that reaction and action are actually different. We're governed by slightly different things there. So, that's something that you would try and get under control during like first responder training or trauma training. And so emotions. Yeah. So what were you saying? I'm sorry. Sorry, Wes, I lost you for a second. Are you there? Wes?
Hey, so psychic attacks. Sorry about that.
So psychic attacks. And so how you attack somebody's emotional systems and thus potentially change how they react to the situation in which they're living is you attack their ideas of reality. Because
Yeah.
your idea of reality or your map of reality that governs, that is the thin ice over which you are always skating, if somebody say pokes holes in that with new thoughts or new ideas, that will upset your sense of stability, because you are a psychic creature and you don't simply have a territory, which is physical space, but you have a home.
Ah,
And part of that home are certain governing beliefs on which several action patterns that you live, or subroutines that you live out, daily or however often, are contingent upon. And so a psychic attack hurts people through causing suffering to them by poking holes in their maps.
yeah, which is a
Um,
incredibly painful. Socrates's his Athenian friends would describe it as being stung with the stingray, right? Or this kind of feeling that you thought you knew where you stood, and now suddenly the ground under you has dropped away, and you have no idea what's going on. Yeah. So the other opportunity though, with psychic powers is to heal, of course, right? So it's not only well, with Paula it is mainly uh attack and some status effects that she can do. She can also restore her own psychic powers by drawing them with a magnet attack from the enemy. If the enemy has any psychic points, she can steal those and regenerate her own. Now
oh,
Ness and Prince Pooh both have the power of so they can heal members of the party. They can heal status effects with their healing psi. Um, and I guess that's it's interesting to me that those can be separate, right? You can have someone who has just attack psychic powers. You can have someone who has just healing. I suppose some enemies have only a healing psi attack. But Ness and Prince Pooh both also have really powerful uh, psychic attacks as well. I'm wondering, sort of like, how much sense it sort of goes back to the idea of IQ as this thing that you can measure as one thing, although it has these different manifestations. Like, how how refined is the measure that we have of IQ, and how does anyone really know how that actually kind of correlates to the different things that your brain, your mind actually does? Creativity, attention, memory, associations, consciousness as a whole, as a kind of reflective activity. Like, have we? All right, sorry about that.
it's okay. And so we were talking about IQ, right? And you were asking just how much can IQ tell us about creativity? Um,
Creativity, association, judgment. What is it actually measuring when we say we have a number, like in Earthbound, we have a number that measures IQ?
Well, let's look at it like this. So, in the Neuroscience of Intelligence by Dr. Richard Heyer, who is now an emeritus professor at UC Irvine, he lays out that IQ is sort of a less sophisticated concept of what's called the G factor, which is it's called G for general intelligence in humans. And you might say there's this psychological distinction between fluid intelligence and crystallized intelligence. And when you're young, you have more fluid intelligence, but less crystallized intelligence. That crystallized intelligence might be like, say, your map of reality or your knowledge.
Hmm.
And So when you get older, you have larger crystal intelligence, but lower fluid intelligence. And Dr. Jordan B. Peterson adds that, and Dr. Richard Heyer agrees, that physical exercise can actually keep your IQ or G factor from dropping precipitously as you get older. Your fluid intelligence declines. And so it's like you're born into your brain and what you know, or you die into that. And so, well, one thing about it is the G factor is measured by 14 different subtests that fall broadly along the 2 dimensions of mathematical spatial reasoning and verbal fluency. And so the tests that go into measuring it are highly sophisticated, and they correlate highly with each other. And so the interesting thing that shows the power of G is that G is the only thing that ensures how well you will do across these tests. It is this sole factor that is derived from these tests. So in taking these 14 different subtests, G is what arises out from them as that which enables you to successfully progress through these tests. And so if you look at G as a general capacity to problem solve, and then you think about what a positive feedback loop looks like, well, and then add to that the idea that humans are almost completely the same in almost every respect, and thus it is the small differences between us that make maximal differences rather than minimal. And I could justify this by saying a 9.58 100-meter dash, I believe, is the world record held by Usain Bolt. A 10-second 100-meter dash would make you a state champion in the US. That's a 0.42, and perhaps I've got, the years off here, a 0.42 difference of a second, but a totally different reality you would live in. And so if humans are psychic creatures or intelligent, conscious creatures that have a general capacity to problem solve that goes beyond simply the behavioral, because we can abstract, and we can start to work on problems and implement them in the world. And if you're a little bit faster than somebody else in terms of IQ, and you're working on, say, 50 to 200 problems a day, and perhaps that's even a difference too, right? You're figuring out 200 solutions a day, whereas somebody else is figuring out, say, 180. Over 50 years, how much more of reality could you have, say, mapped? How much more crystal intelligence might you have? How much more sophisticated might your approach to a problem be than somebody else who hasn't been either hasn't used their IQ or doesn't have the same level? And so I think there is quite a bit of difference between humans that goes unexplained by IQ, and I think IQ only explains a very, very small part of us, but also a very, very small part of us that can lead to an extraordinary difference between us. Because like the major difference between, say, an astrophysicist and somebody, and like, say, a window cleaner is not that they're not both interested in things rather than people, because obviously they both like the heights and are both willing to work with equipment of differing levels of sophistication, but rather probably IQ, right? Because the one deals with information that would probably bore and could not be interpreted by the other. And, well, you could probably say that in both cases.
Right. It's interesting that IQ is a kind of abstraction of different problem-solving abilities that emerges in that it somehow emerges out of abstraction from a series of tests, and it reflects an abstraction from the abilities measured by those tests, if I'm understanding correctly.
Right. And in fact, the graph that shows it in the Neuroscience of Intelligence, you'll love this, is like a little pyramid with rays coming up from the subtests, which all have correlation values between them of like 0.4 to 0.7, like huge social science correlations, because like Peterson is related that like a 0.5 correlation you like go dancing in the streets naked for, and all of these are like and these are all like 0.7. And so that's another thing to add, that the correlations between the existence of a G factor proved by these different cognitive tasks
Hmm.
that in conjunction show the G factor have numbers that are mind-bogglingly high for any psychic phenomenon. They're much
Hmm.
higher than anything else that exists, and they also have higher predictive value than
Hmm.
any other psychic phenomenon, the second of which Peterson has presented as being conscientiousness.
All right.
And so, which is also much lower in terms of, which is also harder to measure
Hmm.
and almost impossible to measure. So the second most predictive factor of human success is impossible to measure, making IQ even more important
All
to
right.
know because you can actually measure it fairly accurately in 20
Interesting.
minutes. So it's
Yeah,
easy
yeah.
to measure. It tells you a tremendous amount about the differences in people, and it comes about. Oh yeah, and the image is of all these rays going up in a pyramid-like way with the letter G above them. So it looks like a pyramid with G for God above it.
Yeah, yeah. This is great because so then the question then becomes like is there this IQ pill that you find by going out on your adventure and exploring every step of the way and finding the gift boxes, and sometimes you'll find an IQ pill inside. Like is there something that corresponds to that? In what way was one gain IQ, or that G factor rather, if to kind of reflect it or measure it? Is there
That's a
a method to get better at this sort of thing, or is it just a gift?
Well, that's a tough one. And Arthur Jensen, who was a Harvard psychologist who came out and wrote the book The G Factor, sort of like lost his good name for coming out and straight up saying that it's essentially genetic. You can easily, and Peterson and Dr. Richard Heyer have recently agreed with and reviewed this literature, but like
Hmm.
essentially IQ, like height, and like many aspects of somebody, like height, like hair color, like eye color,
Hmm.
like symmetry of face, like
Hmm.
skin tone, like curly or straight hair, is of course it's genetic. It's genetic in the same way that all that which is human about you is genetic,
Hmm.
and thus of course so would your IQ be, because although it is represented as an abstraction and is your capacity for abstraction, it is rooted in the fact that you are human, that
Yeah.
the fact that you can think and use an IQ. And so the research has come out that even with jumpstart programs, you cannot increase the IQ of young humans. You just have to continually have like good humane conditions
Uh-huh.
that are salubrious, that allow for human flourishing to occur, so that all things in one's life improve, so that like as the generations go down, and your children are healthier, they live longer, they have more access to health care and good food and resources, and like the lack of
Yeah.
warfare, plague, and disease will enable the slow increase of IQ. And so whether there's a pill or not, I would say that if I were just trying to understand what that pill means, it might mean like the real it reminds me of the rare candy from Pokemon that would just
Yeah.
increase you a level, but the thing is your stats wouldn't go up as high when you
Right.
use the rare candy, which I
Yeah.
really liked, which I thought was like the appropriate way to think about using something like Adderall, because Carl, which I connect this with a slight bit, like something that enhances your focus, though
Uh-huh.
the research suggests that it doesn't have any long-term positive effects. But the thing about using like Carl Jung says, beware of unearned wisdom.
Yeah. Yeah.
And yeah, so hmm, I'm it strikes, I don't know, those pills might be like what the realization of an IQ is, like if you properly if you direct it towards that which you give your greatest attention to and build the greatest possible map of some subject specific domain, then you can be a great version of the person who enacts that subject. So like if you give
Uh-huh.
Jeff all the IQ pills and all the attention, and you see that as a metaphor for giving him all the educational opportunities possible in order to become the greatest possible smith, then he will have the knowledge, he will have built the knowledge and skills necessary through the appropriate use of his, in the maximal use of his IQ, in order to be a master smith. And it could go the same way with the young lady as well.
Right.
So I'm very much divided on how to understand that. But just to answer your question, there does not seem to be like an actual IQ pill,
It,
though that would be like the fountain of youth in terms of scientific breakthroughs.
yeah. Well, so the the other way that you do this then is you put people into a party together where somebody in the party has the IQ, somebody else in the party has the the kind of well-rounded and um, conscientious, maybe that, or that hard thing to define, right? That makes them
Mm-hmm.
just um, as able to help on the adventure. Um, and then I think it's interesting to me too that the the point you brought up a little while ago now was about how the psychic nature of people relates to the difference between a terrain and a home.
Mm.
Um, and that's such a huge theme in this game. And I know you've picked up on this because we did talk about this the other day too. Maybe just to connect with that a little further, um, how does the because this is the other huge leap that takes place in the game is towards the end. This is getting ahead of ourselves a bit, but towards the end, Ness goes into his own subconscious, it seems like, and
Mm.
he has to battle the kind of reflection of himself. It's his nightmare is what it's called, but it takes the form of the Mani Mani statue that you've already fought in Moonside earlier. So there's this kind of recapitulation of that idea that you go into this strange place, you face this terrifying thing, and then you can only by doing so emerge back into uh, the world, and you emerge much stronger. In this case, after Ness's nightmare in Magicant, the world of his mind, his memory, or whatever it is, he emerges and he gains, a huge amount of levels and statistics, and are increased enormously, and he's sort of OP for the rest of the game. He's overpowered compared to the rest of the team. And and it has to do with the melodies, right? So you go into that world of his mind after you've gotten all these melodies, the melodies which, of course, are reflective of your sanctuary locations, right? The this kind of idea that these belong to you, that they're waiting for you, that they correspond to you in some deep way. Um,
Mm.
so I wonder how that connects with the idea of an increase in IQ corresponding with humans' ability to see space and know it as their home or something like that.
Well,
Um,
let me see if I can. You've just sparked off a million ideas in me. We truly are in the Cave of Wonders, Mr.
okay.
Westchat. So I see it as representative of something of infinite value, but not exactly the same as IQ. So if I think of video games and comics in which, and just a few very quickly, where you have to go down into the unconscious, down into yourself, and to learn something about yourself, which you then have to struggle with, and then you come back and you're stronger. That happens in Final Fantasy not once but twice with Cloud Strife. Like the final battle, he completely self-actualizes and defeats Sephiroth, who was invincible as far as he was concerned, because he was the ideal towards which he strove that he could never defeat, who then
Yeah.
corrupted himself. And but also in Xenogears, which makes it explicitly Freudian, where you fight id, which in the Freudian psychology, there's the superego, which is like the tyrannical structure of society, the ego, which is your conscious mind, and the id, which is the sort of subconscious instincts like sexuality and hunger, which play upon you.
Yeah.
Subcortical systems, we would call them nowadays in neuroscience. And then I think of Scott Pilgrim. One of his last tasks is he has to fight his own dark side.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
so what the Jungians would describe that as a descent into the underworld to face that which you hate about yourself. Like the alchemist would say, putting your hands into the shit, into the feces, the place you don't want to put your hands. And that's your own feces. That's your own dark side, your own aggression, your own instincts, and understanding yourself as an animal. You harness the animal within, which makes you capable of doing conscious violence, which makes you capable of fighting and defending that which you love.
Hmm.
Which is interesting because I recently read A Billion Wicked Thoughts, and I know I just hipped you to it. And one of the and Peterson's tells you the five most frequent romance novel heroes are billionaire, werewolf, vampire, pirate, and surgeon, which are all powerful, like alpha male dominant figures who possess the capacity to do harm, but also are highly sophisticated, right? Billionaire or like immortal vampire, or of course highly sophisticated surgeon. So these are men who have harnessed the animal, the chimpanzee like thing within themselves, but now use it like a human in the service of something of great value. And it strikes me that that's what happens with Ness, and that's something that is even more important than perhaps having a high IQ. And the Jungians would call that individuation, or at least the very first step alongside it. And that with that increase in your personality, because you understand not only yourself far better by understanding your sort of animal aspect, but you also understand and can forgive those around you much better, because you see their sort of territoriality, their hunger, their lustful selves. You see that not as in, like, say, a morally indemnifying way, but we're all these animals that have these forces working on us at all times. And so it just helps you to understand what's actually happening in a real way rather than just an ideal way. Maslow would say that you drop down from the bee world or the being world, where you see everything in its ideal aspect, like in an anime or something like that, into the D world, the deficient world. And in that deficient world, you find the gold, the Jungians would say, which is the information that allows you to see the dynamism between the deficient, like sort of material, real world, and the world of being, or your ideal world towards which or from which you first came and fell, towards which you strive. And so now that you can see these two aspects of existence together, you are forever sort of, empowered. You've integrated like a whole nother aspect of yourself. And it's even represented as another figure, like the shadow. It's like you become as strong as two people.
Yeah. The image of Sephiroth, of id, those are both games that are high on my list to go back and talk about and think through further. I know you mentioned our project for this summer is looking like Harry Potter with Sarah Miller. That'll be really cool. I hope that we can also carve out some time to keep watching and discussing the rest of the Studio Ghibli movies and a few other movies too. I think we should have that time. So I'm gonna let you go, and thanks again for coming on.
Oh, it ended all too soon. Ended all too soon.
I know it's I try to keep my Bookworm game episodes in a compartmentalized little section, although perhaps like IQ, they can in some future time reach out and expand in ways unforeseen.
Yes.
But yeah, I look forward to talking to you again soon.
Yeah, can't wait. Thank you for having me on.
Great. Take care.
Bye.
The podcast you just heard was published with Anchor. Got something you want to say to the creator of this show? Send them a voice message using the Anchor app, free for iOS and Android.